thanks to all of you for coming out to the Arctic Room at the National Arts Centre overlooking Canada's majestic north. There's an old joke that says Alberta farmer comes home and discovers that there's been a hailstorm has ruined the crops and the barn is burned down and his wife has run off with the farmer next door. And he shakes his fist to the heavens and he says, "God damn the CPR." Today, in an unusual twist, the Premier of Alberta announced that she's going to become a railway baron. So we're going to try and make sense of how that switch happened. I have had 8 guests, really quite spectacular guests here at the NAC this year. Nobody was harder to get, took more persistence to get than Rachel Notley, the Premier of Alberta. I think partly it's because when everyone else said, when other potential guests said no, I just gave up. But there's always a reason to have Rachel Notley come back, so I had to keep asking. And finally, she had organized a tour out east to educate us Outlanders about how things really work back there in Wakanda. And she was gracious enough to add us to her schedule. So please welcome the Premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley. Very much. Well, what on earth will we find to talk about?
Sports?
Yeah, that's true.
Favorite TV shows?
I'll tell you what, you might as well take a victory lap. Tell me about the Grey Cup.
Well, as I said this morning, Calgary won in Edmonton, beat Ottawa, Alberta beat Ottawa. You know, it was good. It was a good day.
It was, it must have been nice to score a win.
Yeah, well, you know, as I said earlier today, I think, you know, we've actually scored a lot of wins. It's just that it seems that because we do, we get more challenges thrown at us. It's like an ongoing test. Oh, you won that one? You think so? Well, how about this one? So that's kind of been the way we've been going.
Let's back up, before we get to the heavy stuff, let's back up to the major win that put you in the history books and that put you on the national map, which was the election victory in 2015. I met you on the campaign trail during that campaign, and at that point you were the leader of the 4th party in the legislature with how many MLAs?
We had 3 others, so myself and the former leader Brian Mason and our now Minister of Education David Eggen and our now Minister of Economic Development Darren Billis. So there was the 4 of us. We were a big group.
How would you compare your level of confidence in being the Premier before that campaign compared to your level of confidence now heading into next spring's election?
Oh, well, obviously, you know, experience is the best form of education, there's no question. And, you know, you forge your will and your skills in the face of adversity. And as you already indicated, we've probably had more than many. So I feel quite confident that I'm more than equipped for the job. But of course, you know, that's what I said at the beginning of the last election too. And you know, I hope ultimately that the people of Alberta will agree with me when they're asked to weigh in on that question sometime next year.
Was there a point in that campaign when you thought, that does it, I'm going to be the Premier?
That when I thought which?
That you thought, I've got it now, I'm going to be the Premier?
Well, yes, as I've told a few people, I mean, it was, I don't know, I can't remember, somewhere between 5 and 7 days before the election. We'd seen a bunch of polls coming in, internal, external, and I don't know why it was, but there was just a certain combination and a certain pollster, and I can't even remember which one it was now, where I looked at it and went, oh my goodness, this is actually going to happen. And so that was a bit of an unnerving day when the penny dropped for me, that's for sure.
Did you feel ready?
At that point, you know, it was more urgent. It was, I remember getting on the phone, you know, we'd had a long day on the campaign trail and I was out till 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, going around from campaign office to campaign office, doing a lot of stuff. And I got back to my hotel room and I looked at the polls and I called my husband in a frenzy and I was like, oh my God, we're gonna win and we have no transition team. This is awful. And I completely got all freaked out about it. And he said, get off the phone with me and call your campaign manager. I cannot help with this. And so I did, and at that point I said, we agreed, we weren't doing any more evening events. We were just gonna focus every evening for the remaining 5 or 6 days working on transition, because we hadn't assembled a team at that point.
Wow. Not even like a skeletal?
Not really, no.
Okay. I mean, even the federal NDP leaders here appoint Brian Topp to head their transition team.
We had Brian working on other things at that point.
Okay. A little bird reminded me of a couple of quirks in Alberta politics. One is that no party that is defeated in an election ever comes back as such. Mm-hmm. The Liberals used to actually, I mean, Alberta's been a province for a century. There used to be Liberal governments, mm-hmm. and then it went away. There was Farmers, there was Social Credit, there was PC, and then...
now there's UCP, yeah.
Yeah. And the other little tidbit is that no government in Alberta, and I expect you take some comfort from this, has only ever been elected just once. Usually once in, they're allowed to sort of settle in. And do you feel like that trend is going to help you, or is that's just statistics and it doesn't have the force of history? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's an interesting observation for people who like to look at those kinds of things. I think the more critical issues are around, what kind of province Alberta is now, and whether it's changed, and what the hopes are of Albertans for the future. And I feel pretty confident that my government, my leadership is still pretty aligned with that. So we'll see how it goes when we get to the campaign. But we're a little ways away from it still. As I've said to other people, I was elected to actually lead the province, to govern. We are going through a very challenging time right now, as you've mentioned, and so my focus really is on that.
Okay. Now, you're the second Notley to lead the Alberta NDP. Your dad was the NDP leader for kind of ever, right? From 1968 to 1984.
Indeed, yeah.
But I'm given to understand that's not the only source of your desire to get involved in public life and your activism, mm-hmm. and that your mom played a role too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. I mean, so my dad, as you rightly say, was the leader and an MLA and the leader of the NDP opposition and the official opposition for a brief period of time in Alberta. My mom was an activist, so I had my dad as an example. I watched him lead. I watched him represent our community as a local MLA, and my mom was an activist, and she was sort of one of those people that, you might say she was sort of pushing from behind, trying to get things done. But in both cases, they shared a similar set of values, and they both drew inspiration and meaning from being able to, make their community around them and people around them to make their lives better. And it was something that I learned very early on, was a thing that was worth pursuing. And so, unlike many people who, look down their noses for very good reason, I'm sure in many cases at politicians, and everyone rolls their eyes about politicians, I actually was raised to think it was a noble profession, that and the law, if you can imagine. I mean, it's quite ridiculous, actually, very out of step, but nonetheless, that was our background.
Did you pick up any sort of practical tips, things that help you on the campaign trail, or meeting, where to stand at a reception, or I don't know what? Like,
no, not so much that kind of stuff. I think really, I mean, as you would know from our history, I mean, as much as my dad was quite revered. I mean, his political height was reached when he managed to elect a caucus of one to sit with him in the legislature, and he led the official opposition in Alberta with himself and his caucus of one, and so it was a tough road for him to hoe. And what I learned mostly from him actually was the example of hard work. I mean, that guy just never ever stopped, and he was everywhere. He crisscrossed the province. The big joke that we have is that there is nowhere that I can go in the province without running into somebody. You would imagine they would say, "Oh, I knew your dad." Now that's common, but what's even more common, or as common, I guess it'd be weird if it was more common, but as common is, I knew your dad, he slept on my couch. Because, you know, the NDP not being a big party, didn't have a big expense account, and so he literally couch surfed his way across the province for about a decade. And so I would watch that and watch him come home, and then, you know, he'd be home for a short period of time, and the phone would ring, and someone, and you know, our riding, where I grew up, and the riding he represented was about 6 hours north of Edmonton, and a lot of the time he'd be driving up there from a long day or a long week in Edmonton. And he'd get home, and then the phone would ring, and someone would be angry that the Ministry of Transportation had knocked down their fence while they were working on the road, and all their pigs were out. And so there was Dad back in the car driving out to help them catch their pigs, you know, at whatever ridiculous hour at night. And so that sort of work ethic was something that I learned very early on. I don't know that I would say that I'm that hardworking, but it gives me something to shoot for.
I mean, I'm a magazine columnist. I'm the least hardworking guy in Canada. I need a nap after that anecdote. He came, you were at University of Alberta as an undergrad. He came and spoke, and you put a bit of a zinger of a question to him. Do you recall the question?
Oh, this was actually at Grand Prairie College. Was at Grand Prairie College. Is this when, I see people have, you've done your research, but yes, well, so he was doing a tour on poverty, anti-poverty tour around the country, around the province, and I was a student at Grand Prairie College and wasn't eligible for student loans because, you know, he had an income. And so the town hall was just wrapping up, and the media was still there, and I stood up in the back and said, Mr. Notley, I don't know what to do. My parents make too much money. I can't get a student loan, and there's still 2 weeks left in the month, and I only have crackers in my cupboard. What should I do? I have no money. What would you recommend? He was mortified, furious. But because he was known to be the cheapest human in the world, go back to the couch surfing stories, he then rushed me out and gave me $20, like $20, 1983 in Grand Prairie, Alberta, middle of the oil rush. Let me tell you, $20 got you like a loaf of bread at that point if you were lucky. But anyway, so yes, you learned some advocacy tools.
Flash forward to this morning, and you announced that you're going to buy some rail cars, and you announced it in Ottawa. We're going to spend probably most of the rest of our time kind of picking apart these issues. But what has brought us to this pass? It might be like, how can you summarize the mess that
we're in?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you know, as many here will probably have heard me say, this is the result of many years and many governments' inability, federal government's inability to get pipelines built, whether we're talking about Energy East, whether we're talking about Northern Gateway, whether we're talking about TMX, whether we're talking about KXL. I mean, you know, just go on and on and on. There's been a fundamental failure to get pipelines built, and for a very long time, people have been warning, listen, we're reaching a critical point here, and we're going to start to have a problem. And so we were just skating very close to the problem when, you know, TMX, when the federal government approved TMX, and things were on track there, and we knew it was going to be a little tight right around about now. But then, you know, and so that's what we're seeing right now. And then what happened was we had a few problems with refineries going down and production picking up a little bit faster than expected. And so we're seeing that problem right now where we have this, we've moved from pipeline economics to rail economics to distressed barrel economics. And that last place is the last place you want to be. And suddenly the product coming out of Canada is selling for $10 when the rest of the world is getting $50, which is ridiculous. So we can't move the product, and the Alberta economy is being held hostage, and frankly, the Canadian economy is being held hostage. So what do we do about it? Well, obviously, the long-term solution is pipelines, and we're continuing to push for that. But we know as a result of the Federal Court of Appeal decision in August that with the TMX pipeline has been delayed by probably about a year. And so even though Line 3 will hopefully, you know, barring any unforeseen barriers, come into effect in about December of 2019, it will only clear the market for a few months until we once again come up against another shortage. And so in the absence of TMX coming online, we need to find another way to move this product out, and we need to keep ourselves away from distressed barrel economics. Rail economics is not optimal. It's less safe and more expensive, but it is significantly better than distressed barrel economics, which is what we're facing now.
I want to make sure I understand some of the terminology in your speech. You said you're going to buy 2-unit trains. Is that sort of 2 train equivalents?
It's what we want is to have 2-unit trains running per day to move 120,000 barrels per day.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to net out to like rather more than 2 actual trains.
Absolutely.
Though, because, okay.
Yes.
So like a dozen trains or something like that?
Well, we've got the numbers somewhere, but it's a lot of trains.
Okay.
A lot of trains and a lot of cars.
Now, you came close to repeating one of the most interesting lines in your speech this afternoon, but not quite. So I'm going to quote it. You say that the current situation is one in which Canada willfully holds Alberta's economy and Canada's economy hostage. I'm struck by the word willfully. People have actually decided they're going to tank the Canadian economy?
Well, I think some folks have, actually. What some folks, a small minority of folks have decided is that they want to hold hostage or handcuff our energy economy. But a lot of folks don't really understand the degree to which the Canadian economy is inextricably linked to the energy economy. And so, this idea that, oh, well, we're just going to keep the oil in the ground and we're just going to carry on in our happy little world, as I said earlier today, flipping condos and writing Facebook movie reviews in our favorite coffee shop, that's not a thing. The reality is that the Canadian economy relies significantly on the investment that's attracted to this country through our energy industry. 20% of our capital investment is from the energy industry. You've probably heard the stats that I like to throw out there, sort of the net fiscal contribution per capita of each province, and you've got around $350, I don't have the exact numbers, but $350 per citizen from Saskatchewan, about $1,100 per citizen from BC, roughly the same amount per citizen from the people of Ontario, and as I said this morning, thank you to the people of Ontario. It's wonderful. About $5,200 per citizen from the people of Alberta. As a net fiscal contributor on an annualized basis to the Federation. And so this is not nothing, like $22 billion a year. And that's even in the midst of the recession that we are struggling with right now. It's significantly greater when oil prices are higher. So there are fundamental elements to not only our economy, but to our community that all Canadians rely on, the ability to fund our healthcare system, to fund our public education system, to fund our roads, our highways, our ports, which, to be clear, are our ports. These are things that rely in great part on a successful and a healthy energy industry. Now, the flip side is that in Alberta, under our government's leadership, is that we've taken great steps to make sure that industry meets very high standards of environmental responsibility, that we transition that industry to being one of the most sustainable energy industries, non-renewable energy industries in the world. We've put in an emissions cap. We've done, I could talk forever about what Alberta has done in the last 3 years through our climate leadership plan. We have moved from last to first, leading the continent in major initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that doesn't come for free. And to make that transition, to make it justly, where we still keep people working, where they're paying their taxes and supporting our schools and our hospitals, and at the same time putting a roof over their heads and taking care of their families, that's where we need to find that coexistence between a healthy economy and worthwhile action and effective action on the environment. And they're not at odds. They must be seen as going together.
Before I let it go, I want to go back to that striking sentence one more time. Canada willfully holds Alberta's economy and Canada's economy hostage. Sometimes Canada can have various meanings. is it accurate for me to read that as the government of Canada willfully holds Alberta's economy and Canada's economy hostage?
Well, I think it's our regulatory regime. I think it's the collection of mechanisms through which we make decisions. So, I mean, you know, we had, as I said, we had decades of failure to get pipelines to Tidewater before this current federal government was in place, and because there was a failure to acknowledge, you know, the obligation to consult meaningfully, to acknowledge the concern around the environment, to acknowledge community concern and the need for engagement, and so that caused the problem. Then as well, we're playing into, you know, efforts to as I say, shut down the energy industry and using pipelines as a tool to do that. And then on top of it, we're also now seeing a high level of regulatory uncertainty being brought to bear by the proposed changes that the current government is bringing in. So all in all, it's just a, you know, and then we have the politics between provinces. I mean, it's just it's a number of things that are coming together to inhibit our ability to act as a strategic, thoughtful, sophisticated economic player on the international stage. Historically, Canada punches above its weight as an economic player, and I believe we have the ability to continue doing that and to keep doing that. It's just that right now it's the perfect storm of decisions that are going against each other, and the casualty is this $10 barrel of oil, which is going to actually impact every Canadian.
Another sentence that I want to throw back at you. You say that building a new pipeline is just about the most progressive thing we can do. I want to ask you to explain that, because I suspect there are in this room new Democratic Party card holders who do not want you to build that pipeline.
So, well, it kind of goes back a little bit to the argument that I've already sort of started to make. You know, as I've said, the starting point is this. You know, our government has adopted a very ambitious, and I would suggest country-leading approach to combating climate change. We are pricing carbon. We're bringing in renewable energy. By 2030, 30% of our electricity will be driven by the most efficiently and affordably incented renewable energy regime in the country, and in some cases in the continent. We're phasing out coal. By 2030. Many people don't know, right now Alberta burns more coal than the rest of the country put together. So our decision to phase out coal by 2030 is a big move. And we're doing that. We're also, you know, we're bringing in a whole bunch of energy efficiency things. And the key thing is that we've put a cap on greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands, which is a fundamentally important thing. So that big move in and of itself is progressive, and as I said, it can't be done for free. We have to be able to manage a just transition towards those objectives. And I would say that, you know, the federal government, you know, wouldn't have been able to go to Paris so soon after they were elected and make the commitments that they did had it not been for the moves that Alberta was already making at that point. And so it's critical that we can continue along this path. The second thing is that, you know, our government, we've done a lot of things. We've raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We have protected our public health care and expanded our services in a careful and prudent way. We've protected our public education, hired 4,000 more teachers. We're building 250 schools after the previous government had left a massive infrastructure deficit. We just indexed our disability payment scheme and our income support payment schemes. We're doing so many important progressive things that ensure that as we make our way through the recession into our recovery, it's a recovery that every Albertan feels and every Alberta family feels, not just at the very, very top. And that's, in my view, the way you build a recovery that will last. But that in and of itself is progressive. But to do that, we must be able to get the best from our value, from the resources that we all own. And the pipeline is absolutely critical to achieving and recovering the best value for those resources.
And one more thing you said in this speech. It was a hell of a speech. You should have seen it. You suggested that for lack of progress on these files, you could end up with a society that is angry and more polarized than ever, which I've learned is sort of code for the kind of society that elects a Trump or picks a Brexit or does that sort of stuff. Is that what you're saying? Is that in order to keep a more consensual society, we have to find a consensus on energy and the environment?
Well, I think that is true. I mean, I think we need to move away from polarization, and what we have to do is take direct aim at growing inequality, because I think that inequality ignored for too long of a period of time hurts community. It hurts civil society. It drives the breakdown of civil society, however you define it, and so we must always keep a very close eye on that. And obviously, it is much easier to promote and grow equality and equity in a prosperous economic environment. And so it's very critical that we always do that. And so this is why I get frustrated when I hear environmentalists with whom I have great common cause and I have great sympathy, but when they talk about things and they choose to ignore the consequences of their decisions on their neighbor or the person that lives across the back alley who is working in the energy industry and who needs to be able to also pay their bills and be part of their and pay their way in the same society, in the same community. And so we have to stop thinking about it in a polar way, in a polarized way. We need to see that one must go with the other, otherwise we will fail on both.
Your job has estranged you from so many Canadian progressives. I'm given to understand you're not really buddies with John Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia, that you're not really in constant contact with the NDP caucus here in town. And earlier you talked about people who sit in cafes, writing movie reviews on Facebook. But those are your people, surely.
My family members, to be clear. In fact, I asked my brother what he does for. I was thinking about my brother as I was thinking about what they do. But
I mean, it's actually possible to imagine an alternative universe in which you had moved to British Columbia and were today the NDP Premier of BC, and you were trying to stop another Premier of Alberta from doing what you're trying to do. I mean, like that sort of cognitive dissonance has got to be a sort of prominent feature of your daily psychic life.
Well, you know, I mean, yes and no. I mean, let me just say that in Alberta, you know, I mean, my riding is that I've represented since 2008. It's the equivalent of the glebe, I guess, here in Ottawa.
Nothing is the equivalent of the glebe.
Well, everybody thinks that until they find their own neighborhood. But anyway, but the point is, you know, it's a very progressive neighborhood, and folks there get it. And the folks that are on their Facebook blogging about movie reviews, when I walk into the coffee shop, they look up and they say, "Great job, keep up the fight. We need this pipeline." So you know, so it's a bit of a light touch when I say that I love people who blog movie reviews on Facebook. Just to be clear, I'm just not entirely sure it's going to make us a lot of money. But so the reality is that it's not an either or. And frankly, I don't really feel that incredibly disconnected from many progressives in Canada, to be quite honest. I grew up in the labor movement. I worked in the labor movement before I got involved in politics. And a fundamental principle of being a New Democrat is keeping your eye on regular working people and making sure that their rights are protected and that their livelihood is protected. And if you keep your focus there, you're going to be a progressive. And that's where my focus is. And quite frankly, I think that our government has a record on a number of other issues that many other progressives could only wish for, in terms of what we've done in education, in terms of the work that our government's done on LGBTQ rights. I mean, we were a laggard in Alberta from the perspective of the government's record relative to the rest of the country. We are moving forward on LGBTQ policy in our education system that makes us a leader in Canada. We're a laggard in Alberta in terms of women's representation and the rights of women. We are now, I would argue, a leader in Canada. We are focused on strengthening our public health care system, not dismantling it and finding ways to privatize it. And so on many, many fronts, I'm confident that our record keeps us aligned with many, many progressives.
I was struck a half hour ago. We were in the green room, and you were giving me the gears about the November cover of Maclean's, in which we depicted.
Which you kind of invited me to.
Yes, no, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
would you like to give me the gears about the November issue of Maclean's? I believe was the question.
Which I was happy to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
It depicted 5 male conservative leaders: Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford and Jason Kenney and Scott Moe and Brian Pallister. Who was very reluctant to be in that photo, I should point out, but he finally came around. And we called them the Resistance. And quite casually, you said, those of us who are actually in the Resistance. And I can't get over the paradox that there are some people in the progressive movement in Canada who would have been quite comfortable seeing you on that cover with those gentlemen. Because they would say, you're getting the dirtiest oil in the world out to the richest market it can find.
Well, I would say that it is not the dirtiest oil in the world, is what I would say quite definitively. And it's because of the work of our government, well, it's because of the responsible work of industry leaders that it is not. And in fact, we're transitioning to having it be some of the cleanest and most reliable oil in the world. And let me be clear, Alberta is not Saudi Arabia. We promote and in fact enhance, as I was just referring to, human rights in our province. We are promoting and enhancing work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Saudi Arabia, which is actually providing probably more oil and gas to Eastern Canada than Alberta is, does not have that record. And so, you know, the reality is that sometimes these things are a little bit complicated, but fundamentally, as I've said before, I feel very confident in our environmental record. I feel confident in the way we have aligned that with the need to support the energy industry in the work that it's doing and support the workers that it employs while still moving forward on key rights-based issues, environmental-based issues, and general pocketbook issues, which are fundamentally important to regular working folk.
Okay. So we've talked about the oil price differential. We've talked about the remedy of buying trains to get the oil to market in the absence of pipelines. How fast will we be able to get that to happen? How fast will those trains be moving?
Well, they probably won't be in play until Line 3 has come into effect. And I know I've heard some people suggest, well, it's not this is not a worthwhile endeavor because Line 3 would already be in play. And so why do this? And as I've already outlined, the concern is that Line 3 only clears the market for a few months before we find ourselves right back in this situation again. And so that's why it's necessary. So it's true, there's still not a solution between now and this time next year. And so that is a different kettle of fish. Another
of the irritants that you wanted to discuss with federal counterparts is Bill C-69, which essentially implements a new environmental assessment regime for major projects, not just energy projects, but just like big things that people want to do. It's caused real consternation in the oil patch. And yet it seems to me that all it would do would be to bring into the formal review process the environmental considerations and the Indigenous consent considerations that wind up getting settled in court anyway. So doesn't this simplify a proponent's life rather than complicating it?
No. I mean, I think that the object of the review may be to do that at the end of the day. And to be clear, even beyond that, I agree that because I was talking about the problems that we'd had for the past decade. I agree that we needed to clean up the system and we need to have a process in place that earns public trust. You know, communities, Indigenous communities, environmentalists, scientists, all those folks need to know that the matter has been fully considered, fully weighed, evidence-based decision-making has occurred. And in a transparent way. So those are all important principles. And so I agree with the object. The difficulty is that in the way it's been drafted, it creates more uncertainty because there's not clarity there. So that's the overarching problem with it. As well, because of the things that we've just been talking about, there is tremendous investor uncertainty in the oil patch right now. And so if you layer on top of it the investment uncertainty that is created by Bill C-69, maybe Bill C-69 by itself might have been something that could be managed. But if you layer it on top of all the other stuff that's going on, it becomes a critical mass issue. And that's why we're saying, you know what, we need to start pulling some of these layers of stuff that we are piling on top of Alberta and the job creators in our province and you know, help them get just a little bit of air here. So C-69 in its current form has a significant amount of uncertainty in it, and you know, I mean, there's the issue of downstream considerations that was primarily raised by the NEB before, but we want it stated clearly that downstream stuff will not be considered, and so that's critical, and then issues around jurisdiction need to be cleared up. So we've been told that many of the concerns that we have will be addressed, but we've been told that for almost a year, and we haven't actually seen it reflected in writing, in the legislation, in the regulation. And until we see that, the whole trust us thing, it's not going to work. And even if we wanted it to work for us, it's not going to work for those investors who are already skittish because of all these other things that we're dealing with. And so it's just a matter of being smart with how we position our national economy in an international setting to make sure that we continue to perform.
Some people have said, people with an interest, including in industry and in big business, but other observers, Wise magazine columnists and others, have suggested that Canada is starting to look like a place where everyone's really nice and so on, but big things can't happen. Because if you need to do something that crosses a provincial line or changes neighborhoods, somebody will take you to court and win. Mm-hmm. Is that a broader concern of yours?
Well, I think that it is, and I think that's why that we have to find that balance of fully airing a matter and then making a decision and going through, and that's why, for instance, on TMX, prior to the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal, that's where we thought we'd gotten, and that's one of the reasons why our government was working so hard. Even after the federal government made the decision to approve TMX, our government was still traveling across the country, educating people, buying ads, meeting with not just like-minded oil executives and financial executives, but also in union halls and going to environmental conferences and talking to schools to let people understand why it mattered, because it was a big decision and it was a controversial decision, and it's important to try very hard to then build consensus, growing consensus, so folks will hopefully understand the logic behind it, and so that's how you work through these tough issues. But we need to move pretty quickly on it, and Canadians as a whole, I think, need to understand that at a certain point, as much as we all like to think locally, if we only think locally, nationally, what's going to happen is we're going to find that there's a lot less in the pot to share.
Okay. As you raise these concerns that are crucial to your province but national in scope, how would you characterize your working relationship with Justin Trudeau?
Well, I think generally speaking, it's been productive, I mean, I think on a lot of matters we share similar values. At the end of the day, my job is to stand up for Alberta and to stand up for Albertans and to stand up for their jobs and making sure that their issues are heard. And so that means sometimes we're not going to agree, and sometimes that disagreement will be aired publicly, and sometimes even while that's happening, we'll be having conversations to try and work our way through it. And I don't think it's any different than on many fronts, frankly, in terms of federal-provincial relationships.
You had a meeting with him, and on the way out of it, you were asked how it went. You said it was a meeting. How did the meeting go?
You know, it was, well, as you know, I mean, I talked about it in my speech. In that meeting, I outlined what we were looking to see the federal government do as a result of the Federal Court of Appeal decision. And they didn't do a good portion of what we asked for them to do. So obviously, I think it's fair to say it didn't go as well as I would have liked. You know, now part of it was honestly a disagreement on tactics, not outcomes. I think it's fair to say we both very much share the understanding for the outcome that needs to happen, which is that TMX get completed and built. We were disagreeing somewhat on the way to get there. I hope that, in this case, not very often that I say this, my husband would be amazed to hear me say this, I hope that someone else is right and I'm wrong, because I almost never say that. But anyway, so at this point we're just saying, okay, well, that's the way you're going, you better stick to your timelines, and particularly with the NEB process.
Do you think he bet too heavily on TMX? He had lukewarm support for Keystone down to the States. He was clearly not a huge fan of Energy East. There was a second pipeline to the Pacific that he outright nixed. And then he said, everything will be fine, we'll get this fourth one. Does that turn out to have been a little bit of a bad gamble?
Well, you know, I think what I would say is that it is, you know, it's not, it's where, I think all of us were surprised by the Federal Court of Appeal decision with TMX, to be fair, everybody, including people, many people in the environmental movement. Quite honestly, the legal consensus was not that that was going to be the outcome. So that is what happened. I think that now, I mean, the previous Northern Gateway project was rife with problems, many, many problems, much more complicated and deep problems than what we're seeing with TMX now. But the decision of the federal government to then follow that with Bill C-48 to ban essentially any products from Alberta from ever leaving a northern western port, that, in my view, has gone too far, because that now is assuming that TMX is going to get done, and that's all we're ever going to need. And I think that the door should be remain open for better constructed projects to be considered through the northern western port.
Bill C-48, which you just described, is the tanker traffic ban. And you say it's a double standard. How come?
Well, because it's not a tanker traffic ban, because it facilitates LNG tankers. And it bans not only bitumen, it bans upgraded bitumen, it bans or synthetic crude, it bans a number of products coming from Alberta above and beyond the bitumen that people suggest that they are worried about. And so it doesn't even allow for proponents to consider projects where they would potentially engage in more refining, which quite frankly is another objective of our government. We're putting massive resources into kickstarting, upgrading in Alberta, unlike anything that you've seen since Peter Lougheed was in charge of Alberta. And part of that could link into work that would result in outcomes, or that would result in us being able to use that northern west coast port. But there's this ban on everything except LNG, which doesn't frankly make a lot of sense.
Premier Horgan would say it's because LNG is a relatively benign substance if it happens to leak out, whereas dilbit, diluted bitumen, sinks to the bottom of the ocean, you can't get it out. It covers all the fish. It's horrible.
He would say that. That is true. I would say, again, that I'm talking about things, separate and apart from that issue, I would say we're talking about things that go beyond just that product. So the distinction has not been made in Bill C-48. But I would also say, I mean, the fact of the matter is that we're in a situation now where a product that comes out of the end of a pipe is subjected to all this kind of consideration. But if we put that product in a train or in a truck, it just gets offloaded onto a boat regardless. So we don't have, so there, and the fact of the matter is there's a great deal of product coming in and out of ports each and every day that actually present bigger safety risks than what would be coming in and out in a double-hulled tanker filled with bitumen or some other product or more refined product. And so there's a tremendous inconsistency with respect to that. And so we need, and it goes back to this issue that what's really happening is people are grasping at every argument to stop the pipeline in order to stop the energy industry, not understanding that even in a place like BC, people in BC, do you know, like, there are at least 40,000 people in BC who live in BC and pay taxes in BC who fly in and out of Fort McMurray and earn their income in Fort McMurray and fly back to their lovely, picturesque mountain town and then buy stuff on Main Street in that lovely, picturesque mountain town and contribute to their community league charity fund and take their kids to hockey and do all those things in BC based on the income they earn from flying in and out of Fort McMurray. And that picture needs to be painted more clearly, even for the folks in BC, let alone for the folks in the rest of Canada.
Okay. Now you painted a kind of a stark cultural contrast between what most people in Alberta want out of the energy environment equation and what a lot of people in British Columbia want. Now, you're a political party leader. You know that Justin Trudeau is getting close, after having been quite an ally to the Alberta oil industry. He's getting closer and closer to a federal election next year in which he might hope for a dozen seats in British Columbia, and he's crazy if he thinks he's going to hang on to the 4 seats in Alberta that he's got now. Have you noticed that that consideration is tending to distract him as time goes on?
Well, you know, I'm not going to hypothesize or speculate over what drives the Prime Minister's actions on any given day. What I would say, and I suspect what he knows, is that that would be a very short-sighted way to look at things. Because at the end of the day, if you are running to be the leader of a national leader of the country, you need to be able to speak to everybody in that country about your record on the economy, and your record on job creation, and your record on attracting investment. And the fact of the matter is that whether there are 2 government seats in Alberta or 30 government seats in Alberta, that doesn't really matter. Alberta still contributes significantly to the health of the Canadian economy. And with the current headwinds that are facing the international economy and the Canadian economy, we cannot afford to let the Alberta economy struggle and the energy industry struggle as we sell our oil for $10 a barrel while everyone else is getting 50. That is not a thing. So as far as I'm concerned, there is no path to victory for any politician seeking to lead this country who thinks that they can do so by shutting down the energy industry.
I mentioned, I don't think it comes as news to you that you're a leader of a political party. And you're heading into an election yourself.
Really? That's why my calendar is so darn full.
We've already had Jason Kenney up to offer his vision of all of these issues and of the looming confrontation between you and him. How do you think the next election plays out? There's an awful lot of people in Alberta who say, you know, Rachel Notley's really nice, and Jason Kenney's tougher, so we'll take him. What would you say to those people?
You know, I don't know that that's exactly the way we hear it, but what I would say is this, that, you know, I mean, first of all, as I've said before, I'm actually quite focused on leading the province through this current challenge that we are facing. But, you know, when we get to an election, it's going to be pretty simple. You know, there's going to be a very clear choice for Albertans to make. You know, our government has worked very hard to support Albertans. You know, it's sort of a, you know, do you cut and fire your way to prosperity? Or do you build and hire your way to prosperity? We are a build and hire government. We've invested, we have protected our public health care and made sure that it's slowly and prudently improved. We have protected and grown and supported our public education system significantly. We have worked very hard to promote inclusivity and to celebrate diversity, whether we're talking about LGBTQ rights or anti-racism. We, generally speaking, have a very progressive, forward-looking view of Alberta's future that depends upon significant investment in diversification, not only of our energy industry, but of our economy as a whole, and repositioning ourselves for the future. That's our vision. The other vision is one that is really very much focused on looking backwards. By admission of the opposition caucus members themselves, adopting a plan that, quote, will hurt, that is designed primarily to enable a tax cut of about $1 billion to the top 1% of the population. So two very different visions. And then, of course, also a very, very socially conservative political party that struggles mightily on issues as it relates to diversity and LGBTQ rights as well as women's rights. So that's the different view, and what I said in the last election and what is true. I mean, people out here have a view of what Alberta is, but let me tell you, it is the youngest, most diverse, best educated population in the country, and it is always, the Albertans are always evolving, and it's not your grandpa's Alberta anymore.
For 50 years, people wondered whether all the people moving to Alberta because of the economic advantage that it offered were going to change the nature of Alberta. Has that happened?
I would say that is in the process of happening, and I would say that our election in 2015 is one example of that.
Okay. Your opponent is probably going to say, well, I'm going to stick with the real Alberta, the rooted Alberta, and there are an awful lot of people in any place who worry that newcomers are going to change the nature of that place, and that might tend to see you as the ally of that newer, stranger Alberta.
Well, I would say that the view of most Albertans is that they welcome that newer, stranger Alberta, and that in fact Albertans embrace change and diversity and opportunities and hopefulness. One of the things, I've lived in Vancouver for 8 or 9 years. I lived in Toronto for 3 years. My husband's from the East Coast, so I've seen a lot of this country. And one of the things that I've always been so struck by about my home is that it is one of the friendliest, most optimistic group of humans you're ever going to come across. And I think it is that same view that drives what I think will be ultimately a positive response to the question you just asked.
Okay. I have to wonder, when you go to your computer and you see the President of the United States congratulating the Saudis for driving the price of oil down and asking them to do more of that, how big a wrench does that throw into your day?
Well, I mean, one of the things we did do is we suggested to the opposition, who just elected an MLA who dined out on the fact that he helped elect that president, that maybe that wasn't the best move. But nonetheless, that's a challenge. And it's one of many challenges. At the end of the day, if Albertans can get full value for the resources, we can sustain, increasing and decreasing values for the barrel. We just can't sustain $10 a barrel. $50, $80, we can make it work. But $10, we're going to all suffer some significant problems.
Okay. Just going to check. Oh my goodness, we don't have a lot of time. First Ministers meeting next week. What's your main message to your colleagues?
We have probably the most significant economic problem facing the country in what is going on in Ottawa, and that needs to be something that we all refocus our efforts on addressing, and I'm going to take every opportunity to raise it at the meeting.
Are you happy with the itinerary the Prime Minister has laid out for that meeting?
I would suggest that it's going to need to be upgraded a little bit.
Okay.
Did I see how I did that? Upgraded?
That's very good. Refined, we might say. I'm going to stop it there. Thank you very much, Premier, for taking the time so generously to lay out your vision of Alberta and of the issues facing the country. And I want to thank everyone here and out in TV land for joining us too. And as always, I want to thank our partners, CPAC, for getting the signal out to the world, and our loyal and faithful sponsors, the Canadian Bankers Association. We could not have done it without you. Thanks, everyone. There's a reception next door. We'll see you there. Cheers.
Thank you.